All right, in an earlier class, we talked about this CSS box model. Not much, but this is what Chapter 5 is all about, is the box model. And the way to look at this is virtually everything that you create on a web page is inside of one of these boxes. So let's assume for a second that this content is that one paragraph. Hello, my name is Jeff Scott, I work at, etc. So what that says is, by default, there may be some padding on here that the browser puts on if I put in none. But the point is, what surrounds your content is padding. You can set padding equal to 0, which means there isn't any, but that still is what's there. Outside of the padding is a border. Outside of the border is the margin. All right? So if I come in here, and this is what I want to show you, is I'm just going to make something. It's going to look kind of garbagey, for lack of better words, but it's fine. So let me grab my index page here. All right. And I'm just going to quickly make this up right in front of you. I'm going to just throw it onto the desktop, and I'm going to call it boxmodel.html. Okay, and I'm going to call it boxmodel2.html. There we go. Okay, and what I'm going to do as soon as this changes color, there we go, is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a div. And again, what's a div? It's just a holder. There's not going to be anything in it. All right? Okay. Then up here, I'm going to say, okay, my div, I should be doing this in a separate file, but I'm putting everything together just so you can see all of it. All right? I really should be putting this CSS into a different file. Say div, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say height 25 rem, width 25 rem, that's 400 by 400 pixels, and color red. Okay, there's nothing big about this, so I'm going to run this. Where's that showing? Yeah, that's a great start today, isn't it? 25 rem width, 25 rem color red. Style. Div. Well, let's bring up the original one that I worked on the other day and we'll look at that. I don't know what's wrong with this. So I'll bring up the original box model. And this one, you'll see it when it comes up in a second. It's almost taken from the one that's out of the book. All right? So, this is the first one I played around with. So, let me bring it up and show it to you. Everybody see that? All right, so let's go and take a look at the actual code. All right, I'm going to come back to the CSS in a minute. Okay, I put 2 divs in here, 3 divs. I've got a div, and inside of my div, I've got 2 divs. All right, why? Just so I can show you a couple things. That's the only idea behind this. All right, and I said, okay, the first div, I want it to have a background color of red. I want it to have a margin of 1em, which is, remember, 1em is 16 pixels, which is usually like the default font size, so you can gauge as far as how big something is. And I'm going to have 1em of padding. Okay? And then my second one here, I gave it a background of green. Let's start by commenting all of this out. Oops, that's right, I'm inside of the HTML file. So let's start by taking all of this stuff and commenting it out. So all I've got in here now are two divs. One is red and one is green. Okay? This is 300 pixels. So I said what I want for these two divs is I want them each to be 300 pixels by 300 pixels in size. I want them to have no margin. I want them to have no padding. And I want them to display right next to one another. Now I want to show you what happens. First, let me save this and run it. Is that pretty obvious? Okay. I'm going to take the line here that says display inline block, and I'm going to comment that line out. Just that line. Okay, so the display inline block. How does that look different? Now do you see the difference? The other one's still there. See that? I wanted him to display on both on the same line. That's why I showed it to you like that. All right, so I want to get that back. And right now, with that back, what I'm saying is show right next to one another. Any padding or margin that's in there was put in by the browser. Did you hear me? I didn't put it in. It was put in by the browser. So I'm going to add a little bit. All right, so I'm going to go to this first div that's right here. All right, and I'm going to take this, the red one, and I'm going to add 1em against 16 pixels, all right, of margin. All right, so let's run this again. Now, you say, well, it doesn't look any, well, it does look different. There is now margin here, 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 and here. All right? So margin is external to your content. Did you hear what I said? The reason I'm telling you that, and the reason that's important is what you're going to see in a minute is padding is internal to your content. So I'm going to really exaggerate this, and I'm going to exaggerate it by, I'm going to take that margin that we just had in there, and again, I'm going to comment it out. But I'm going to take the padding, I'm going to put a lot of padding in here on purpose. So I'm going to say 3em, 3rem, it doesn't really matter. All right, so now I've got 3rem in there. Okay, you see the difference in the size? So we can go in there and you can play with all this stuff any way you want to play with it, as far as you can add padding, you can add margin, but what I want you to understand, because probably that wasn't the greatest explanation, but what I do want you to understand with what we just looked at, come on, is if this is your content, and I change the padding on the content, so let's say that I've got two of these pictures that you see right here. I've got another one right there. Okay? If I increase the padding, that's the area, even though it's going to look like it's in here. Even though it's outside, it's going to look like it's in here. So in other words, it's going to look as though my particular div or whatever it is I'm working with got bigger. Margin is what's between this one and whatever one is next to it, or whatever one's above it, or whatever one's below it. Does that make sense? All right. And border is what you think it is. It's adding a border. Okay? Now, there's a lot of ways you can add border, and you're going to see that in the chapter here. There's dashed borders, there's dotted borders, etc. I grabbed one of the examples that was in the book. They used dotted ones. I think that's really ugly. You may or may not agree. And it really doesn't matter. You can always change it. But I think, I have not even looked at your next test yet, but to my knowledge, when you take your next test, they'll ask you to do some of this stuff. So you'll be playing with border, you'll be playing with margin, you'll be playing with padding. All right? Now, the majority of your next test will be on chapters 4, 5, and 6. You may be asked to put some more content in, because again, there's not much in there right now, okay? But the majority should be just on what's on 4, 5, and 6. All right, so I'm just going to start. It's 8:59. I'm going to go for 5 minutes, and then we're taking a break. So chapter 5, as it says, is on the box model, which is most of the chapter. All right, you say, no, it's only a couple pages. It's all relative to the box model. Then we talk about sizing and spacing of elements. All right, I've already mentioned margin and padding to you, so we're going to look at it some more. Then they give you a web page example. Then they show you how to set borders and how to set backgrounds. All right, and after they do that, they come back and they give you a web page that's got all that stuff in it. All right, so again, if you don't like the example I just gave you, this is the one the book uses. I think it's a little harder to read, but what the author is mentioning here is there's your content. All right, so this is padding top, if you look on the screen, padding bottom, padding left, padding right. There's your border, and a border by default is all the way around. But you can put on a border left, a border right, a border top, and a border bottom. So if you only wanted, for some reason you didn't want this one here, all right, then you could have a border top, a border bottom, and a border left, and leave out the border right if you wanted to do that. This is your margin outside of it. So this is your margin top, your margin bottom, your margin left, and your margin right. All right, and that's what they're explaining in here. One thing to realize, and this sometimes trips up people where it says this formula. I'm not going to read the formula to you. But the idea is when you add margin, when you add padding, etc., okay, on your page gets bigger. All right? So people always think too, well, if I'm saying that my page is 960 pixels, all right, or 60 Ms or Rems, okay, that I've got to use all 960 of those. Typically you don't. If there's 960, you might use 955 and leave a little bit. All right? But read this because they do show you in here. They talk about the box model. Again, I'm not going to read it. All right? But it says you can use the other properties to sit there and make manipulation of what they call block elements. You can manipulate your content. All right? So they give you a web page that illustrates this. And notice what they're using in here, and the author even says we're basically doing it in here purposely, is we're using pixels. Pixels are an exact unit of measure. Pixels and points. The recommendation today is anytime you're creating your own website, you don't use pixels and points. They should only be used, for lack of better words, as a last resort. Now, if you've got something that literally is 1 pixel, so it's so small you can barely see it, that you can use, as opposed to saying like 0.1625 rem. You could do it either way. That's not a big thing. So this is the page that I took, the one that I showed you before. I just changed some colors in it. So notice what they've done here. Then we're taking a break. Notice the body says it has a border, 3-pixel dotted black. That's the one that's around the entire body. You probably, in some time in your life, whether you realize it or not, have gone out to a web page that has a border around it, even if you don't realize it. All right, some sites think that looks really cool, okay, and there's nothing wrong with it. Okay, then, so we've got that one. So that's around our entire body. All right. Then if you look around main, we've got a 2-pixel solid black border. Well, what's that? That's this one. Okay? And inside of there, what do we have? Well, we've got an H1, and our H1 has got a 1-pixel dash border. That's this one right here. Okay? And our paragraph has got no margin in it, and padding left, 15 pixels. It's literally just set up to try to make it look fairly square, that it looks fairly decent. All right? But you should be able to start looking at this stuff, if nothing else, if what I said didn't float your boat and you still don't understand it, there's not much here to key in. Create yourself a blank page, key this in, go in here and just start changing the numbers. All right? That's a really good way to learn this stuff. All right, so let's take a break. It's 9:04. Let's come back at 9:15 and we'll pick it up on page 172, how to size and space elements. All right, then to continue on, we're up to page 172, how to size and space elements. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn or anything you don't already know, that everything you put on a web page has a height and has a width. All right, you can set neither, either, or both. All right, and as what you'll get to, and really what we'll get to probably already next week, is we'll start to talk about how to take a website and make it responsive, I should say. In other words, as we shrink it down, we want it to still look nice. And I've shown you this before, but I'm just going to show you it again. In the real, so to speak, TravisTrett.com website, if I go out to the store here, you see how this is got 12 things in it. It's 3 across. But if I start to shrink this down, you'll notice, well, that one doesn't look real responsive, but it still looks okay. In other words, it doesn't look junky where something is cut off or whatever. I thought it would look better than that, but I guess it doesn't. But if I come out to here, let's try the tour. All right, you can see that after a while, the stuff stacks on top of everything else. Okay, and you're going to learn how to do that. It's not that it's very difficult to do or anything. So, notice in here when we take a look, we've got width, height, min width, min height, and max height. All right. Now, a couple things that are in here. We've talked a little bit about images. And when we did images, we just looked at them a real little bit, but we'd say something like image source equals, and then you'd have the name of your image, and then alt equals. Okay? Images all do have a height and width, like everything else. All right? And in the olden days, like in the 80s, whatever, all right, people would put into their image tag height equals and width equals. That's considered very, very poor practice to do that today. You should always, if you're going to do any jacking around with heights and widths, you should do it in your CSS, because again, that is affecting the aesthetics of your page, and the aesthetics should at least ideally always be done using CSS. Now, as far as the other thing that's in there, so that's width and height. All right, you may end up using max width. All right, and sometimes what people want to do is they want to say, you know what, resonate this as though it's 1260 pixels, regardless of how big the medium I'm using to resonate it on. When you make stuff too big, and you probably have all seen this already, if you make something a lot bigger than it's supposed to be, like if you've ever looked at an image that's blown up too much, it starts looking grainy. And the same kind of thing will happen with a web page. So again, they talk about setting here the width of a content area. And notice again, they're using pixels. And we already talked a little bit about width auto. We're going to get to that some more. And you do the same with height. And you could set minimum and maximum. Again, some of the nuggets, so to speak, in this book are in these descriptions that are in here. I just don't have time to sit and go over every one of them, and I don't think you want me to read to you anyway. All right? But a lot of times, if you come up to me, and I'm not picking on anybody in the class here, but at least historically, people will come up to me and say, "Hey, how do you do this? How do you do this?" I can tell you haven't read the chapter. All right? Because it's shown right in there. One of the reasons we're using this book is virtually everything they discuss, they show you an example of how to use it. All right, margins, again, we've talked about a little bit already. And notice there's margin top, margin left, margin bottom, top right, bottom and left, and there's just margin. If you use just margin like that, you can do that. If I say margin : 20 pixels, That means I want a top margin of 20 pixels, a right margin of 20 pixels, a bottom margin of 20 pixels, and a left margin of 20 pixels. Does that make sense? It's a shortcut. It's much easier for you to write margin as opposed to write 4 of these. Even if, let's say that each one is a separate size. So 5, 10, 15, and 20, let's say. So rather than saying margin top 5, margin, etc., I can say margin, then I can put in colon, 5 pixels, space, 10 pixels, space, 15 pixels, space, 20 pixels. If you list all 4, it's top, then right, then bottom, then left. I mentioned this to you already. I said, look at it like being like the old-fashioned digital clock. All right? So 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock type of an idea. And they show again in here how you can do this. Now notice there are some more shortcuts. I've shown you one of them. So margin 1M would give you 16 pixels of margin all the way around. Top, right, bottom, left. If you put in 2 numbers, the first number goes for the top and bottom. The second number goes for the left and right. Or right and left, I should say. All right. If you put 3 numbers in, all right, then the first one is for the top, the second one is for the right and left, and the last one is for the bottom. I find it starting to get confusing when you do that because, wait, what is that again? All right. What you will do over time is you'll come up with your own comfort level for doing these things. Oh, that makes sense to do it like that. I'm really hoping, and I haven't looked, like I said, at your next test yet. I will before tomorrow. But I'm hoping they don't do that where they say, now do this and put in just 3 numbers. You know, I mean, to me, that's silly. You should start doing it the way that you're comfortable doing it. All right? Padding works virtually the same as margins as far as how you set it up. Just padding, colon 20 pixels, 20 pixels right top padding, 20 pixels right padding, 20 pixels bottom padding, 20 pixels left padding. The numbering system works the same as it does for margin. But again, whereas margin is external, padding is basically in the content of the thing itself. All right? Now, books aren't going to agree with what I just said because they'll say, no, there's content, then there's padding. Yeah, that's true. All right, but what you see, it looks as though it's part of the content itself when you start working with padding. Sometimes the hardest thing to do when you're creating a website is to know when to use margin and when to use padding. So how do you figure it out? You use one, you look at it, you comment that line out, and you use the other one. And you see sometimes it literally, for lack of better words, won't look like it matters a lick. Oh, the other thing, I guess, if you're going to set something to 0, you don't have to put a number afterwards, like 0px or 0m or 0 is 0. Doesn't care. Just turns it off. All right, so here's a web page that illustrates sizing and spacing. Okay. I mean, and when you look at it, it doesn't look that different from the stuff that we've been doing. But they're starting to refine this, so they're having the programmer take some more control by adding more CSS than what's been added before. And as always, they show you the CSS. They show you what's new. All the new stuff is in yellow right there, or whatever you call that, mustard colored. Notice, so this says width. So that's the default width, not a max width, just the default width on that, okay? And margin, this is what I tried showing you before, to center something. All right? Here we're turning off margin and we're turning off padding. And then they show you, I believe, do they show you the, no, they don't show you the HTML. Now, next they talk about this, a simple reset selector. You may or may not remember this, but we did talk about this earlier. If you use asterisk, it means affect everything. So if you want to have probably the easiest normalized file, and if all you care about is margin and padding, you can do this. So asterisk, curly brace, margin 0, padding 0, curly brace. All right, that's about the simplest reset there is. All right, how to set borders and backgrounds. The border style, if you take a look right here, notice what you have. Dotted, dashed, solid, double, groove, ridge, inset, outset, none, which is the default. What you almost always find on web pages is when people use these, they use a solid border. It's easiest on the eyes. Again, the dashed one can be a little like this, where it's a little crazy on the eyes, or the dotted one. You may not agree, but again, it's always where if you are going to work for somebody and they say, I want a dotted border, I'm not going to say, yeah, no, you probably don't want that. You get a dotted border. Okay? And again, you can do different things with color. Normally, you can do all these things that are shown in here. You can do them separately, but almost always you put everything together. Okay? And so, you set up everything. Rather than doing it like this, where they have the separate ones, you put everything together. And the order shouldn't matter. So you should be able to say 3 picks, solid, green, or green, solid, 3 picks. It really isn't supposed to matter. Most people put the size first, okay, then the type, then the color. It's just kind of a historical way that most people tend to do it. All right, this probably is the, I'm not going to say hardest, but most complex part, these last few pages of the chapter here. The first one talks about how to add rounded corners, and then they get into shadows. Now with rounded corners, you typically use a border radius property. All right? And there's ways you can set it up so that it's totally round, so that it's totally elliptical, or that you just have a little bit of rounding. It's considered, again, we're not there yet because we're not making sophisticated web pages. But what a lot of people like to do is that, for example, they like to take their buttons and give them rounded edges. It's a little more pleasing to the eye. In fact, once we get into, I don't know what chapter it is, we get a little further in the book, we'll talk for a week or two about something called Bootstrap. All right, Bootstrap is basically, it's a framework that allows you to kind of supercharge CSS. But their buttons are naturally rounded. All right, and they look nicer. Plus, they're colored, where by default buttons are gray, so they're kind of blah looking. They're gray with black writing. But you can change that. You can change the color of a button just like you could change the color of anything else. So as we look in here, and I'm up to page 187, now notice what they've done. It says around this section, we want a border. We want it to be 5 pixels, double line blue. That's the blue, as you probably guess. All right. Then with the radius, notice again, I think that radius goes left. Trying to remember. I think it's left here, right. So left, top right, bottom left. So notice we've got 10 pixels right there, 20 pixels here, so it's more rounded, 0 pixels here, so it's still square, and 20 pixels here, so it's again rounded. Would you want to do that? Well, to me, that's, I don't like that look, but you never know. All right? And again, sometimes it might be that you go to work for a company, or if you're a freelancer, they may have some kind of a logo that looks like this. All right? And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not typical. That's all. And then box shadow that we talked about earlier. Notice they've got a red box shadow around it. As it says, when you code the border radius, you can assign one rounding to all 4 or separately. Okay. Background colors and images. Well, we've talked about background colors already. You've looked at those. you've used different background colors. All right, so there's not a lot new here. All right. But what's going to happen is when we start talking about putting images on our background, that's where it's going to change a little bit. All right, to just say background green, it's no big thing. We did that for the Travis Tritt site the first or second day. All right, it wasn't hard, I don't think, for anybody. Again, you can say either background or background color. I'm going to mention something to you. Don't write it down. It's not worth it. But remember it because you're going to see it again. When you are working with JavaScript, okay, if you wanted to use this right there, where it says background color, you would not say background minus color. You would say background color, you'd run it together, and you'd make the C capitalized. Because in true JavaScript code, it thinks you've got a variable named color and a variable named background, and you want to subtract color from background. All right? But if you're working with just CSS, then it's totally fine to do this. You know, because people will say, well, what's the advantage of writing background color as opposed to background? Well, when you're first learning, it might help you to put the word color in there. If it doesn't, then don't use it. It really and truly doesn't matter. They both work exactly the same way. Now, when you start to work with an image, all right, it says, what do you put in there? Well, you have to put in, as it says, a URL that points to the image. Well, that should make sense. You can also specify the keyword none if you don't want to display an image, which is the default. I don't know why you'd say that when it's the default. All right. A lot of the time in here, they're going to mention something to you, and they're going to say X, Y, and Z is the default, which means if you do nothing, you get Z. All right. Now, then there's repeat, and I used to show people this, but it got to be a little bit irritating. What happens is, by default, let's suppose that and I could do this for you right now. I probably have to remember how to do it, but let's suppose I find a real little ping of one of those little yellow smiley faces, and it's about this big, let's just say. Okay? If I put it on the screen as a background, by default, it's going to put as many of them on the screen as it possibly can. It's going to repeat. All right? If I only want it to repeat horizontally, I can do a repeat X. If I only want it to repeat vertically, I can do a repeat Y. But by default, repeat means repeat X and repeat Y. Okay. All right. Background attachment. It says it specifies whether or not the image scrolls with the document. It's not that big a thing today, but a lot of companies, what they have done in the past is on their websites and stuff, they might have you ever heard of the term a watermark? Where they put something on a site, and it might be a very light little image, and they don't want that image to move as you scroll up and down the page. All right, that's when you'd use a background attachment. And then finally, background position. All right, it says one or two relative or absolute values or keywords. In other words, do you want that image to stay on the screen in that spot regardless? If the user scrolls, you can just have that image be there all the time. Okay, that means that it'll show always, even if you've got other content, that other content will show underneath it. All right, or won't show, it'll be covered by it. They show you the syntax for it and some examples. But again, until you start working with it, it probably won't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. I can almost bet you're going to be asked to put some kind of an image on your next test. All right. All right. Gradients, you may or may not have heard of gradients before. Gradients are typically, for lack of better words, I use them, they're used kind of like for morphing. So this is morphing from here white to red, here from red to blue. All right. Years ago, and it was funny because my kids are all grown up now, but when they were little kids, they watched, maybe you'd even seen it when you were a kid, Barney the dinosaur, and they had a really good morph when Barney morphed into Hitler. That was one of my favorite things of all times that I saw, because I watched hundreds of hours of Barney. All right, and now what's that? What? Yeah, with my kids, and now I'm watching hundreds of hours of YouTube videos that families put on there all the time because my granddaughter loves them. Oh, Papa, come in here, watch videos with me. Yeah, that's a real good time. All right, so when you set up a gradient, you've got your choice. You can have it gradient horizontally. You can have it gradient vertically. You can have it gradient diagonally left to right, diagonally right to left. So virtually any way you want. You can put multiple colors in there. Typically, people have just two colors or two shades of the same color. All right. I don't have any idea. Like I said, I'll try to remember to look at your next test before tomorrow and let you know that whether or not you've got a gradient on there or not. Right. Some people love them. Some people hate them. I would say if you are going to use these, see, one thing you never want to do, and I've seen this before, where somebody goes out to a website and the colors are beautiful, the fonts are beautiful, it looks fantastic. Oh, wow, your website's just great. Really, what are they trying to sell? I don't remember. Well, then you kind of ruin the message, because it should be that the website's beautiful, but you don't have any idea what it's doing. I'd rather have it be ugly and have it be very functional. Sometimes when you go into some of this stuff, you're going to have to put on what are called browser prefixes. All right, and you'll see that as we start looking. Okay, for example, here we've got minus WebKit. That's for Chrome and Safari. Minus Moz is for Firefox, Mozilla Firefox. Minus O is for Opera. And I think minus MS is for Microsoft, like IE and Edge. Now, and I'm going to show you this because it seems to be a good time. So let's say that, geez, I'm not going to remember that. I mean, can I use gradients in Firefox? I don't remember what page he said it's on. So I go into caniuse.com and I put in here gradients. And boom, it shows me where they're not supported and where they are supported. That's a real nice site. Now, it's not that big a thing anymore, because if you've got a fairly current version of Edge, or you've got a current version of Firefox or one of Mozilla or Opera, they pretty much support everything. All right. But if you're using older versions, notice Opera, okay, it's 12.68 right now, it looks like, or something, or maybe it's 68. But if you're still using version 10.1, it doesn't support gradients. All right. And what does that mean if it doesn't support something? It depends. Usually it won't show anything. All right. But there's little hacks and stuff that you can put in there if you want to or need to. So the chapter ends with a web page that uses borders and backgrounds. So notice what they've done here. They now have a border around their whole page. And their background is a gradient. Again, I'm not saying you like it. It doesn't really matter. It's what they're showing in the book. All right? And as it says, it's the same web page as they've shown earlier. It's just that they've added that stuff to it. They show you the CSS. And again, if you look at the mustard color, that's what's changed. Again, these are the browser prefixes that I mentioned. And it's kind of an important concept too, that not so much for in here, but if you are creating a website for someone, so let's say it's a month from now and you're starting to feel comfortable with it, and you've got a friend or a parent or somebody that wants you to create a website for them, you should test it in a lot of different browsers. There are emulators that you can get, so you can be on one browser and emulate what it'll look like on another browser. There's even emulators that will emulate tablets, phones, etc. All right. In fact, I've shown you this before, but if I hit F12, okay, and I go out here, and I go, what is it? I think it's the second one. Toggle device toolbar. I think that's it. See, that's what it'll show. There it is in an iPad Pro, etc. It's not going to have everything, and it's also not going to be exact. Because I've had people tell me, well, yeah, I looked at it in here and here, and it looked just fine. I don't understand what the problem is. Well, nothing is exact. All right, so if you're working on something that's on an emulator, that doesn't mean it's going to look exactly like that. All right, and now I screwed up my resolution here. So let's go back to 100%. And that's it for the chapter. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the office just for a moment. I want to see if that stuff printed out yet. Mr. Corrigan said he's going to have to take this printer probably apart because we think there's a little piece of printer paper stuck in there. So what happens is about every third or fourth page it just locks up. And I'm tired of that. I tried digging through it and I couldn't see anything. And he said, oh no, I've done this before, so I'll let him do it when he gets around to it. All right, but I'm going to go over there. When I come back then, like I said, so what have we done? There you go. Very quickly, we went over the test. I do want to help people with GitHub problems. All right. I've lectured on Chapter 5. I tried to print this out. I want to see if it printed out in the other room. And if it did, I'm going to give it to you. All right. Probably tomorrow then, what I'll do is I will have another handout that I give you. Not a handout, I'm sorry. Another email I give you, which will have the labs and the homework for chapters 5 and 6. Now again, Evan at St. Louis and Paul in St. Louis, they're using this GitHub Classroom. I've had some problems with it. All right? And I'm still working through those. You've got GitHub. They're using GitHub Classroom. What's the difference? They're pushing their stuff to a different repository than you are. That's the difference. But they're doing the same stuff that you're doing. So the rest of the period today will be lab. I would suggest if you haven't been looking at the chapters, at least page through it. And if there's anything that doesn't make sense, come back tomorrow and ask. Just so you know, tomorrow when we go over chapter 6, which is what we will do, the focus changes a little bit, and what it's on is on different formats for page layout. 2-column, 3-column, fixed versus fluid. And that virtually is the whole chapter. Okay, it's about the same size as the chapter today. Okay, and like I said, I'll be back then in 5 minutes, and I'm just going to, I know the three of you had some problems yesterday getting that to work. Then I'll just, since I'm right here, I'll probably go by you first, Gabe. Then Jimmy, I'll go by you. Then Connor, I'll go by you. And we'll see if we can get all those to work. Am I right in assuming with the rest of you that you're not having any problems with either Git or with GitHub? Is that a fair assumption? Because if it's the next test and you do have a problem, just let me know. One of the reasons that I gave you those flash drives is as a backup. I mean, if we lose our internet connection and you're taking the test, you're going to have to all save them on your flash drives. All right? Okay. That's it. So like I said, I'll be back in about 5 minutes then.